I'm Sharon Constanson. I am Chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce, UK, which is based in London, and we are focused on making a difference in South Africa in all ways we can, business and trade and communities. Thank you for being with us today. We've got a very distinguished panel and guests with us today, and we'll be starting with a video. We're then going to follow with a presentation and then a conversation. So the first person I'd like to introduce to you is Arlene Wilson-Max, great friend of mine and somebody I can't wait to see on Thursday next week because I will be in South Africa myself. So really looking forward to seeing you, Arlene. It will be great fun. Your energy travels this distance, but it's always better in person. So looking forward to time with you. Arlene is in charge of stakeholder relationships in the BEE Chamber, and she is the person that gives the guidance, the development support, and actively drives the BEE strategy. So she's working on things like best practice in the Yes for Youth program, bursary management, internships, all these various things. And it's through her initiative and creativity that we've put together this entire program. So I thank Arlene because we have consistent high numbers of people attending. So thank you for being with us. Can I hand over to you for a few moments?
Yes, thank you, Sharon, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am about to share screen and show you my video.
BEE Chamber. In 2010, the National Development Plan set a goal to increase the employment rate from 13.6 million to 24 million people by 2030. The number of individuals employed needs to increase by 9 million between now and 2030. Then BEE was introduced in 2007 to secure contributions from government and business towards economic growth, enabling inclusion of more South African citizens to address unemployment and alleviate poverty. If the National Development Plan and BEE was designed to grow the GDP and create jobs, then why has unemployment increased after their introduction? Our population has grown from 41 million in 1994 to 60 million people today. In that time, the number of employed South Africans has also grown by 6 million, from 8.9 million to 15 million, representing a growth in employment rate from 20% to 28.5%. However, the unemployment rate has increased over the same period from 22% to 32.6% because population growth has outperformed job creation by a factor of 3 times. What this means is that South Africa's population growth has outperformed the country's job creation. The distribution of unemployment remains highly racially skewed, with white unemployment sitting at only 8.8%, which is on par with France and is lower than Italy and Brazil. Whereas the South African Indian unemployment rate is 11.8, colored 25.7, and African 36.5, making African unemployment the 7th highest in the world. The exceptionally high unemployment rates for Indian, colored, and especially African men and women is the reason for Black economic empowerment in South Africa and the reason for the objective of the BEE Act being meaningful participation in the mainstream economy for Black people. Join the BEE Chamber today to understand more about the original intent behind BEE and how you can align your business targets and plans to contribute as a good corporate citizen and to achieve a level of pride from your corporate contributions. As a member, you will access up-to-date information, support, guidance, services, software and training to support your transformation journey.
Thank you, Sharon. I'll hand right back over to you to introduce our next speaker. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity again to play our video that explains why BEE is so important. And also to congratulate you on our 8th webinar in our series.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, our 8th, and we are doing our best to promote transformational, meaningful, and sustainable BEE that actually contributes to income generating activity for Black South Africans in South Africa. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you, Eileen. And this one, we are talking about our focus is employee share ownership programs and broad-based ownership schemes. So Reona, I'd like to introduce you. I'd like to join us now. Reona is going to give us a short presentation. She's the technical specialist at the B-BBEE Chamber and is recognized as a competent technical signatory, whatever that means. I'm reading. She's highly educated in this space, and she's highly experienced in this area, and actually ensures that she is literally leading edge on all the BEE acts, the codes of good practice, and the peripheral legislation that is feeding this whole arena of making sure that we are giving hope and opportunity to all our people in South Africa. She's a very analytical thinker. She also has the ability to work out the most optimum solutions so that the companies get what they need, but the individuals get what they need, and the law is applied. So thank you very much, Reona, for being with us today. Looking forward to hearing what you say, and then we will be in conversation thereafter. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and welcome to all our participants this afternoon. Thank you for joining. I hope everybody is keeping well, keeping warm. I think winter is slowly creeping up on us here in South Africa. Sharon, I think you are nice and warm on the other side of the world. But yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump straight into my presentation. Okay, so this afternoon, what I will briefly touch on, because I don't have a lot of time, is the vehicles that we look at that can hold ownership within a company. And that is a trust, an employee share ownership program, and a BBOS, which is a broad-based ownership scheme. All right, so just a quick recap or overview of ownership, very short. Ownership measures the rights of Black people, or the rights that they hold within companies as a shareholder. So the rights to vote, the rights to receive economic benefit from their shareholding. Also, maybe just a recap of Black, but I'm sure all our attendants have heard this definition or this concept before, but Black is a defined term in the Act, and it refers to a consolidated or a global term for African, colored, Indian, and where applicable, Chinese citizens of South Africa. So just a brief overview of what the definition of Black is. Now, if we look at the scorecard for ownership specifically, as this would be our discussion point this afternoon, is, as I said, there are or measures for which we award points in ownership, and that is the voting rights held by Black people, either directly as an individual, indirectly through a company, a trust, a share ownership scheme, etc. So the score breakdown, as you can see on the screen, is out of a total of 25. Now, ownership is one of the 5, so technically there's 5 priority elements, each having a sub-minimum requirement to achieve. So for ownership as a priority element, on the 8 points of net value, a company is required to meet at least 40% of those net value points in order to avoid a penalty. All right, so if we look at the priority areas, as I said, there's 7 priority elements. Ownership, as I mentioned, 40% of the net value points now translated into a percentage. Black ownership held by Black people is 10%. So effectively, if a company has 10% Black ownership, managed debt, so there isn't a debt component to it, the priority requirement for ownership has been fulfilled. Now, the penalty for missing the sub-minimum requirements on all the priority elements is that your overall level that you achieve will be discounted 1 level down. So if you, for instance, through all the elements achieve a score of a level 5, but you've missed your sub-minimum requirement of ownership, your level will then be discounted to a level 6, and the level 6 will then be what is reflected on the BE certificate at the end of the day. All right. Now, within ownership, you have two concepts, the flow-through principle and the modified flow-through principle. What this basically means is you have to flow or recognize the Black percentage owned by a natural person through a structure to the ultimate measured entity. So we always, when we look at ownership, you always flow it back to a, like I said, natural person, in this case, a Black natural person. In a multi-tiered structure like this, you always flow it through into what the ultimate recognition would be on your scorecard for that Black person holding shares within the measured entity. Now, the modified flow-through principle is basically a modification and enhancement of that flow. Now, again, if it is a multi-tiered structure within ownership, again, you would flow it to the natural person or the Black natural person. But if, for instance, within this structure, we have an entity, a trust, that is at least 51% Black owned, with the modified flow-through principle, that entity where the 51% is reflected actually becomes 100%. Now, this is only applied once in the structure. So if there's multiple entities that are 51% Black owned, the modified flow-through wouldn't be applied to all of them. It is once in your structure. Modified flow-through is only applicable to economic interest and voting rights of Black people. So it doesn't filter through to the women portion, not on the net value, not on the broad-based ownership scheme portion, and not on net value, or Black designated group portion and net value within the scorecard. Right. Trusts. So trust is basically an arrangement or an agreement between a person, which would typically be your founder or your trustee, on behalf of the beneficiaries. So they hold the property, the shares, pretty much the income of the beneficiaries. So they act on behalf of the beneficiaries. Now, what we've seen in South Africa, and specifically with your foreign multinationals, is where educational trusts are becoming more and more common with these companies, where an educational trust is put in place as a vehicle for ownership. Now, with the trust, and an employee ownership scheme, a broad-based ownership scheme, all of these vehicles can take the form of a trust. There are certain requirements set out in the codes when we recognize what we can score on the ownership scorecard with regards to trusts, family trust, ESOPs, and BBOS. Now, these requirements are, as I said, set out in the codes. If a company wants to achieve 100% of the points that, or the recognition of what this trust will bring to their ownership scorecard, they have to comply with both the rules and requirements as mentioned, as well as the additional rules as set out in the codes. I'm not going to go into that detail specifically this afternoon because it's just too much to cover in a short space of time. Now, if we look at an employee ownership scheme, from my experience, I have seen a lot of ownership schemes in the form of a trust. So very important to note, there are rules for an employee ownership scheme and rules for a trust. Now, in the case where an employee ownership scheme is set up in a form of a trust, you have to comply with both the requirements of an employee ownership scheme as well as a trust. The requirements are on the screen. I don't want to spend too much time in going into too much detail here, but it is basically the employee ownership scheme is set up as an ownership vehicle for employees of the measured entity, and specifically Black employees of the measured entity, to hold the rights of voting and economic interest or economic benefit through this scheme. Then we have what is called a broad-based ownership scheme. And this is, I think I don't want to say it's obvious because it might not be as obvious as I think it would be, but broad-based meaning it can incorporate a community. It can incorporate a broad spectrum of communities, people, individuals within the scheme itself that at the end of the day are the shareholders within the measured entity. Again, certain requirements in the codes that have to be met in order for this broad-based ownership scheme to receive the recognition on the ownership scorecard. Again, highlighted in some of the points here on the screen for you. Very, very briefly touched on trusts, ESOPs, broad-based ownership schemes. I like to refer to ownership as the devil is in the detail. Ownership itself can be a full day discussion on what works and what wouldn't work. There are multiple structures and vehicles within the ownership element that can ultimately result in a score for ownership for a company. There isn't, unfortunately, a one-size-fits-all solution for companies in South Africa. Specifically the types of entities, multinationals, small businesses, big businesses. So ownership, briefly touched on trusts, ESOPs, and broad-based ownership schemes. I have got the floor open for questions, but I think, Sharon, we will maybe step into the conversation part of it, just in terms of time.
Thank you very much. If you want to stop sharing your screen, that would be great. Thanks very much, Reona. You did say something, and I don't know if I lost concentration, didn't follow you, or there's something strange there. There was one slide where you said people, Black men and women. Then you said the women are excluded. What were the women excluded from in that particular mathematics?
So that you're referencing the modified flow-through principle. So the modified flow-through principle, just a recap, is where there's an enhancement added on the shareholding within your structure. Now, if you look at the scorecard of ownership, you have your voting rights, which is voting rights for Black people, voting rights for Black women. You have your economic interest for Black people, for Black women, and then your designated groups, broad-based ownership schemes, etc. When we apply the modified flow-through principle, because you're already enhancing the recognition of an entity within the structure that is at least 51% Black owned, we can't apply that enhancement across the entire scorecard, because effectively what you're doing is, the enhancement is already creating a favorable score in ownership. So it is only applied to voting rights and economic interest over all of Black people. So I wouldn't say women is specifically excluded because they are part of the Black people component in the scorecard. It just means that it doesn't filter into the Black women portion of the scorecard for economic interest and voting rights.
I think I understand. Thank you very much for clarifying that, Reona. I really do appreciate it. Murray, would you like to join us? Because you are going to be in conversation with Reona, and I'm going to be the one doing the watching and not the working, which will be fantastic. To the audience, could I ask you please to put any questions that you have into the Q&A function? I will pick those up and we will use them in the conversation, but particularly towards the end of the session, we will pick up your questions as well. So please offer them, keep them succinct, please, and then I will translate them and pose them on your behalf. So thanks very much for your contribution on that. Murray's joined us. He's CEO of the Signa Group, and I read the first couple of words of his bio. I thought, yeah, that's the man I've just met. Energetic, optimistic leader who believes in South Africa and the potential of its people. Not often you see that as an opening sentence of somebody's short bio. Very impressed. It's very you, Murray. Absolutely apt. Whoever did that knows you well. specialized in the implementation of private equity, but as well as employee ownership and broad-based ownership structures. So he's the one who helps organizations find a sustainable and financially feasible ownership structure that works. As Reona was saying a moment ago, it needs to be unique to every organization. There isn't the one size fits all. So that's where Murray comes in and works out based on your needs, your objectives, your plans, your future, the company, the industry, the people, whoever else is involved. And he uses his experience in this area to guide strategies so that they are aligned, one, to best practice, they are sustainable, but they are fit for purpose for the specific organization that he is consulting with. He does a lot of other things in the community environment and is very engaged in empowering our people, and shared a story with us a little earlier when we were waiting, that for a negligible amount of money that people as a family pay for now minimum price, but to get affordable Wi-Fi, how that has changed the people, the environment, the economies, and made those communities sustainable in a different way. And it's amazing that 80 Rand per household can make a significant change of that. And what empowered me in that conversation, Murray, we were having earlier, is every single one of us can make a difference to South Africa's future. If all it takes is 80 Rand to do something like that, think of the power we all have in our hands to change South Africa. So thank you for your energy. Thank you for your focus. And I'm looking forward to witnessing and sharing your conversation with Reona. So over to you, Murray.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Yeah, and just to highlight that story a little deeper, the lady that I was referring to in particular was running a creche in a township called the Leeuwenhoutbos, just outside of Johannesburg. And because of COVID, she had to close her creche and lost her income. But because she had this affordable internet access, she pivoted, that funny word we all use, that she pivoted her creche into an online tutoring business. And she's now the biggest online tutor provider in the township, and is now creating more jobs and helping more people than she's ever been able to do before. So it just shows me that for 80 Rand a month, having internet access gave her the ability to transform what would have been a disaster for her family and herself and the little children that she was servicing into a very successful business. So anything's possible.
Everything is possible. Thank you very much, Murray.
And I think if I may, Reona, the challenge around ownership, which you and I deal with this all the time, is it's so complicated when you present the legislation in the way it's drafted. But the overriding principle that I think has been very useful from a Signa perspective and how we engage our clients is to just say, what's going to make business sense for you, the client? What actually is, what's going to make sense for you? And for many multinational companies, and UK companies in particular, that embrace this idea of transformation. And if you think about it, UK companies for many, many decades have been great supporters of transformation in South Africa. Even pre the 1994, right through to today, have embraced this idea of real meaningful transformation. And so what we find when we chat to clients is to say, does it make sense to align your business growth in South Africa to rewarding employees? And some businesses are really well suited to including their employees in the growth trajectory of their business. Or for some businesses where it's not suitable, either they have a very small employee base or the employee base is not suited for inclusion in a structure, we look at potentially broad-based ownership structures which help communities. And this resonates very strongly with multinational companies and companies from the UK in particular, because now the legislation has been cleared up to make it much more practical to bring about employee ownership or broad-based ownership, because there was a time when the legislation was gazetted and the BE commissioner gave an interpretation of the legislation which made it very restrictive, almost impossible to implement a practical program. And we've been very blessed that the Minister of the Department of Trade and Industry and Technology, the Department of Trade and Industry has clarified that that broad-based ownership schemes and employee ownership schemes can be implemented in a much more simple and understandable way. Very closely aligned to how they operate in other countries, because employee ownership and broad-based ownership is not unique to South Africa. It exists all over the world. In fact, I think we are learning from other countries about how to implement employee ownership structures. Very common ownership structure used globally. But now with the clarity that makes it much simpler to do, it's much more accessible to companies. So. And there's some very successful structures out there. So my encouragement to anyone who's kind of looked at broad-based or employer ownership in the years gone by and realized how difficult it was because of the interpretations made by the BE commissioner at the time, we've now got absolute clarity from the Department of Trade and Industry on how to implement structures like this. And it's much clearer, much simpler, much more practical. So if your companies have ever thought about it and go, we don't want to do this, it's just too complicated or it's too limited. We're now in an environment where over the last couple of years, the clarity from the minister has allowed us to implement these structures. And we've been very lucky to do so at Signa Group, for instance. One of the shareholders in Signa Group is an employee, not an employee, it's a education trust, and so every year when there's a profit share declared up to the shareholders, the education trust will receive a dividend, and that dividend is used to put young Black women through university education. So it covers their it's like a full bursary program. So in a sense, that's a true broad-based ownership scheme. There's a defined class of persons called Black women studying tertiary qualifications. That's our defined class. And 100% of the distribution of the dividends received by the trust are distributed to the costs of these young women that are studying towards their degrees. And the structure now has been working for 5 or 6 years, and we've seen our first doctors, our first female doctors, our first group of female engineers have qualified because of the flow of economic interest up into that education trust. So I just wanted to sort of paint a picture that things are much better than they were a few years ago. And I really encourage companies, if they are looking at employee structures or broad-based structures, that they can make a really meaningful difference if they're executed well.
Yeah, maybe I can also just give some insights from our involvement. So we also recently started this process of an educational trust as well with one of the leading IT systems companies, multinational here in South Africa. So they've actually identified a gap in the industry, in the IT industry, specifically for women. And very specific, not just your programming Java and those very specific IT gaps within South Africa, and specifically women. And they then took it upon themselves to also put an education trust in place with female students at universities, also covering, the cost of them studying, so that they don't worry about, something small like, where am I going to get my next meal? I need to eat in order to study. Where am I going to live? All those things. The focus is to enable them to study, to get that education, to be part of the economy of South Africa at some point in time, and then closing those gaps within the IT industry in South Africa. So it works. To piggyback of what Maria said, it is actually working in South Africa. So yeah, maybe a consideration, a broad-based ownership scheme or even employee ownership scheme. What we found with employee ownership scheme is that it shows commitment by the company into their workforce, that they believe in them and they want them to grow with the company. So what better incentive than to have them part of the shareholding of the company, enjoying in the benefits of economic growth. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Reona, on that, when we were going through the time of a lot of sort of negative publicity on employee ownership schemes because of the BE Commissioner's narrow view, I did a bit of research into employee structures and what they call employee participation programs around the world. And the research revealed that companies that implemented employee participation programs, particularly this was research coming out of the USA, demonstrated better performance than the companies that had not implemented such structures. But there was a massive caveat to that statement, and that was that it was only with inclusion of the employees in the decision making of the organizations in which they were participating as equity as shareholders, that you saw the improved performance of the company. And unfortunately in South Africa, we've kind of been through a dispensation where employee structures were used purely as an empowerment vehicle to help companies with their Black ownership recognition on their scorecards, and never really embraced employee ownership from the point of view of including employees in the actual participation in some of the strategy development, or even some of the thinking around like how shareholders would typically participate in a business. And the truth of the matter is, it's very hard to do that very well, where you can actually get real participation of employees in things like decision making, or even just some sort of strategic inputs into the company. And we have a problem in South Africa in that a lot of employees are never considered in that way, that they can participate actively in the, let's call it, the management of their destinies. It's not common practice in South Africa. And so as a result, where companies do implement employee share ownership schemes, that correlation of employee ownership resulting in superior company growth, you don't see it happening very often, because we haven't actually followed best practice, which is to engage employees in the process. And I've implemented a few structures where one of them was a fairly large transport and logistics company, and they decided they were going to implement an employee ownership structure with all of their drivers and the teams that drove the trucks. And what we suggested them is to start the process by engaging employees first, and not just present a structure and say, well, yeah, you are part of an ESOP, but engage the employees first. And that engagement took probably about 18 months, almost 2 years of engaging and communicating. And that structure has been incredibly successful for that business. They've gone on from strength to strength in a very tough environment. And so that was kind of the lesson there. But I've also seen structures where an employee share ownership scheme was implemented, and a year later, the company was almost shut down because of strikes and people, just because firstly, they didn't understand the structure. There was expectations that they'd get these big payouts, and the structure backfired, and they almost shut down the business because of labor unrest. So it's something that one has to be very mindful of when implementing any of these structures, is that you have a good engagement process.
Just to ask a question then, Marie. If you were advising a company A, company B, and you were their concern was the latter of your two examples was a relatively reasonable risk because of the nature of the industry or the trade unions or the location or whatever it was. What are the key things they should do as management, working with their labor force? I know you said bring them in the beginning, all the right things, but is there something tactical, practical that you can share with us that can make that difference to a successful outcome?
Yeah, so I can say the way we've done it at Signa is we create a framework which we call a participation unit framework. It's a little bit, it's just one of our creations that we've come up that really seems to work. And basically, what we do right in the beginning, we engage with the shop stewards and the employees, and we say to them, listen, here's a framework based on how we see individuals participating in the structure. And we basically allocate each individual in the employment a unit of participation in the scheme. And it gives them a sense of ownership. And we value that participation unit, and we allow that individual to effectively know that they own something real. Even though it's a unitized scheme, they own something real in the company, as opposed to some kind of theoretical idea that they're participating in a structure. And then we explain how they can grow the value of that participation unit over time based on the performance of the company. And we also allow them to vest that unit in the future so that there's a real economic benefit at the end. That seems to deal quite effectively with the misconceptions around entitlement or expectations of a big payday right up early on, because those are the things that create the misalignment.
Yeah.
And then the other very practical thing we do is we get the employees to elect employee representatives into a process. And we work with the employee representatives over time. So, because if you don't do it that way, if you don't have a direct line of communication between the employees and what you're trying to achieve, we found that backfires. So it's this idea that you actually have something tangible. It's really just a piece of paper, I guess, that says you've got so many units, but it's tangible, and they can understand the value accrual to that. It's the one thing. And the other one is employee representatives across the entire implementation phase. And then once a year, we have meetings where we engage the employee representatives, we present them with information, they take that information to the employees. That has worked. Where we haven't done that, or the client hasn't felt that it's necessary, it's always never worked.
The problem you have being an entrepreneur, being a business owner myself, is I've actually got to generate income. I've got to run the business. The business has got to deliver its product, its services to its customer. Otherwise, it is not sustainable. I'm not an HR expert. I'm a widget expert. So therefore, trying to ask me as the chief exec to do some of these things doesn't naturally fit with the day job, which I can imagine causes a lot of the failures in themselves. So my question comes around as the external, do they see you as being a more trusted party? Do they see you as part of the organization? Or do they see this as abdication by the ownership to someone like yourselves? How do the people feel?
This is a crazy story, but the one I went to do exactly that, and because I was a third party stepping in, I was detained in the boardroom by the shop stewards for a day. I was basically, hijacked. They wouldn't let me out. We eventually had to call the CEO of the company, and he had to address the workforce before they would release me from I don't know, because they were not interested in dealing with a third party. They wanted the CEO of the business to take ownership of this thing. So I experienced.
So they do a transformation change, and you ran the company for a while.
But it was quite the only reason I kind of made it out alive, I guess, was that we ended up realizing that we all supported the same soccer team, and so we ended up talking soccer for the day.
But sport can solve a lot of things.
Yeah. So our experience is there has to be absolute buy-in from the leadership and the shareholders of the existing business. And then it's easy to have appointed representatives on either side to get engaged with the follow through of the process. But if the leadership and the shareholders are not upfront and passionate about actually doing this, my encouragement is don't do an employee ownership scheme if you're not absolutely passionate and determined to do it as the owner of the business or the CEO of the business, because it's going to backfire. And
I saw one that backfired. This is not BEE specific, but it was ownership by the loyal staff who had been with the organization for a good period of time. And at the time that the company was listed, they were given a percentage, 5% of the shares or something were given to the employees in some form of share ownership scheme. And the problem that evolved, this would happen in a BEE involvement, and particularly if you've got blue collar workers, it would be even worse than this was. But the challenge you've got is that this is now potentially, in this case, a listed company with a share price that is dependent on market forces times many, not an environment that's within the control of the owner. So, and the main share, the executive ownership of the business. And share prices in one of our Black Fridays in October, somewhere in the past, the share price value over a very short period of time halved. And you sit now and try and explain that to a workforce. How often have you come across that? Because this created a forever and still present huge negativity towards the change leadership that caused the change in the organization. And they were personally blamed by the workforce for the halving in the share price, which we all know is not necessarily the case. There could be bad management, of course, but in this case, it was external market forces. How does management manage that one?
You can never be undereducated about how ownership works, because the truth is, anyone who is an owner in a business, they call it the risks and rewards of ownership. And unfortunately, I've seen too many examples where we only talk about the rewards of ownership. But the truth is that any shareholder takes upon the risks and rewards of ownership. And so that's part of the rhetoric and story that needs to be told. In listed environments, it's a lot easier because you've got every day the employees can look at the share price and they can get an understanding of whether they're doing well or not. But we've found that if you have a very robust, and I have to say very basic and because the stuff is complicated, Reona slides, it's complicated stuff. And if we can't communicate it in a very simple way, there's always these challenges. So communicate, simple, engage.
And your other point was show the risk reward, the threat and the opportunity that come with
understand.
They need to see both sides of that coin.
Yeah.
Rona, you were talking about educational trusts and these various trusts that have been formed. Now, from my limited knowledge in the space, because I'm nothing like the two of you, I've heard of a lot of organizations that for their credits that they require, that might be related to BEE, it might not be, it might be some other investment credits they've got to get, are starting up what you referred to as these trusts, foundations, places where it's part of their ESG remit as well, where organizations are saying, actually, we do want to make a difference. We want to actually own that difference. We want to ensure that the outcome is what we want. And we want to now attach this to our business rather than giving money to another NGO or charity or third party that they would want to do it to. Is this a trend that people are doing? Why are they doing it other than what I've just alluded to? Are there other legislative reasons that are encouraging this behavior?
I I wouldn't say there's other, from my experience, it is purely from a BEE and transformation aspect, where companies, you do get your companies that are doing it for the right reasons and truly wanting to transform. But then you still have companies where it is a tick box exercise, managing to get the points sort of thing, buying the points on a scorecard.
Buying carbon credits.
to comply with BEE purposes. And what we found or have seen is trusts and employee ownership schemes, broad-based ownership schemes are mostly used as a fronting vehicle. So yes, on paper you do have a trust, but there's not necessarily a beneficiary identified of the trust. So it all looks great on paper, and they get the recognition, of that ownership held through a trust in this instance, but the beneficiaries never really reap the benefits at the end of the day.
Because companies don't have the they're making widgets, they're manufacturing automobile parts, for example. They're not educators, they're not community people. So should companies then say, if I'm going to do this, do I actually spend the salary to employ the right person in my organization at an executive level to own this transformation?
Truth be told, I don't think it comes down to, not educated enough. I think it is just a means of, window dressing, if you want to call it that way. I think companies are very educated in terms of what is a requirement or what can be done within the ownership space, but they're taking the shortest route to get the recognition of ownership, or the 51% Black ownership, or the 25% Black ownership, whatever the case may be. I don't think it is necessarily a lack of education. I think at the end of the day, most companies implement ownership because they have to for tender purposes. For tender purposes, if they don't show Black ownership, they tend to lose money. So let's quickly do something to get the recognition. And that's, I think, where the BEE Commission is playing a big role, or have been playing a big role in this space. But the problem is the focus is always on ownership. Now, the scorecard or BEE is not just ownership. It is management control, it is education, it's skills, it's socioeconomic development. So unfortunately, ownership being such a risky element where a lot of fronting is happening, you see a lot of emphasis placed on ownership. But I think also with the BEE Commission in place since 2018, and her purpose, among other things, is to investigate these fronting practices. More and more of what companies have done in the past have been highlighted. Now, being highlighted by the BEE Commission as being investigated for a potential, ownership transgression is already immediately negative publicity for that company, and they start to lose money. So it varies, but I think companies are smarter than what we give them credit for. I also want to say they knowingly putting fronting practices in place, specifically on the ownership.
So Marie, what would you as Signa advise organizations that you might come across that you sense it's not sustainable, financially viable, all the things that you're focusing on, and are, to Reona's point, a fronting practice? How do we get organizations and executives now to take the transformation we want them to take?
Yeah, so I do confront this issue all the time, and I think it's about education as well, because often a fronting structure seems like a sort of the path of least resistance. the issue around a fronting structure is that you don't need the BE commissioner to be scrutinizing your structure to be found guilty of fronting, because if you're a supplier to a large organization or a state-owned enterprise, and the procurement officer there questions your credentials, and that your credentials are found to be a fronting structure like Reona was talking about, then you are criminally liable, and that criminal liability can be instituted through that procurement officer who says, listen, I've discovered that you are breaking the law, and it's a criminal offense, and I'm obligated. They're obligated to report that to the South African Police Service. So the legislation is quite punitive in that regard. And what we've often recommended to people who find themselves in a fronting structure, either ignorantly or they were just following the path of least resistance at the time, is to help them understand that there is actually a positive opportunity set if you implement these structures appropriately. And so just to give you an example, one of the pieces of legislation in the Black ownership scorecard is a structure that talks about private equity ownership, and it's one that I find particularly attractive because it allows companies to invest capital into a private equity structure, which is then invested on their behalf into Black empowered entities, but it helps them get Black ownership on their own scorecard. And it's a different approach. You're still embracing transformation. You're still investing in South Africa. Signa Group has managed to raise probably R1 billion worth of foreign direct investment into South Africa to help so that companies can get their Black ownership recognition through these structures. Or we say to a client, listen, engage in employee ownership or broad-based ownership, but do it in a way that's going to have a feeder back into your business. Example, an education trust. Why not have an education trust that will create a talent pipeline for your business, like the ICT one that Reona was talking about? Because companies spend huge amounts on recruitment, trying to recruit talent. Why not have a talent pipeline arising from your broad-based ownership structure, which is what we've done at Signa. We're wanting to train engineers. One of our businesses is in the engineering space, and we've now got young Black female engineers who are part of a talent pipeline into an engineering business that came out of a broad-based ownership structure. So once you can start connecting those dots and show how your ownership structure can actually save costs in some of your recruitment fees, for instance, or bring about a talent pipeline, or in the case of private equity, help you to invest into your supply chain, for instance. Now suddenly Black ownership becomes part of your business strategy, not a tick box exercise or a tax on the business, because you're going to follow your strategy anyway. Now you can incorporate,
you can supply into your strategy
through your Black ownership structure. So it just requires a bit of thought.
Yeah. So it's back to the point I was trying to get to. It needs to have the right kind of experience. Let's say the experience of the two people with me now, rather than mine, at my elbow in my business as part of my executive team, or insourced as part of my executive team, who know what the answers should be, know how to do it best, have the experience. So it is owned by the executive. They see the value. So that to me would be one of the key transformations for executives to get from where they might be now with a front structure, say, well, I don't know what to do next because I'm actually a widget maker. How do I get to this, which is something completely, I wouldn't even know what needs to be trained. How do I pull it together? And my thought would be it's actually a new role in the organization in a way to own that at a senior enough level. You disagree?
Yeah, I always believe that the ownership structure is the purview of the CEO. I don't think you can outsource it, or the CEO must take ownership of it. Doesn't mean that you can't have people like me, being on your elbow and helping you through it. But if it's not owned at the exec level of a company, in terms of buying in and driving the ownership strategy, it never works. and yes, you might not have all the information or all the experience or all of the things, you know, as an owner, and then you can lean on organizations like Signa Group or whatever. That's fine, but the buck stops with the CEO, as far as I'm concerned, and there's no delegating that away.
Thank you. I really appreciate what we've enjoyed today. I could carry on asking you questions. You gave me a whole bunch of questions to ask you, which I haven't even got to, because I found lots of other interesting ones that I wanted to ask. So thank you so much, both of you. I found it extremely enlightening. And South Africa is in a very, very different place in its empowerment of its people and its ownership structures. And you made the point earlier, Mario, I think it was you, Mario, maybe Reona, where globally we do see share ownerships to differing degrees of success anyway. This is not new. What we've got is we've put a color element on it. We put a time energy into it because this needs to be done now, not one day. So South Africa does have its aspect of uniqueness as well. So thank you very much. And also to those that have put questions in, thank you very much for those. I did build them into some of the questions I was asking. So I really appreciate your time. Closing comment, one sentence, Marie, then Reona.
Well, my closing comment is, if you have a good idea of your business strategy and where you're wanting to go, there are ownership structures that can walk alongside that and deliver the value of Black ownership whilst supporting your strategy. And if you get that right, you've hit the magic button.
Right, let's find some magic buttons. Reona?
Yeah, so on my end, ownership has always had this negative connectivity to it, because I think a lot of fronting is happening on that space. But ownership, you know, if you have your structure that is truly, you know, supportive of your business, of your transformation goals, you are kind of set for life. Not just from a scorecard perspective and you know, achieving the points from an ownership point of view, but also, you know, your transformation is then, I think, Murray, you touched on it, it is from the top down. It is, you know, executive putting in that effort, and it just shows commitment by the company, be it a broad-based ownership scheme, be it an employee ownership scheme, be it, I don't know, a share option as an example. It just, you know, it shows that companies are working towards transformation. Maybe not enough, but every little bit helps.
Well, a series like this are the ones that help inform and give the opportunity for people to understand it isn't what it felt like 20 years ago. Arlene, thank you very much for the opportunity to have shared this time with the BEE Chamber again, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Murray and Reona, wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Awesome, guys.
Enjoy the weekend,
really
everyone.
It. Yeah, oh goodness, it's Friday already.
Yes.
All the best, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Bye.